Welcome back to the Sage Audio channel. Today we'll discuss how to prepare your mix for mastering. We'll cover what the maximum peak should be, if you should use any plugins or processing on your master output, how you should export your mix, and more. We'll also listen to an example of a mix that was correctly prepared and one that wasn't, so stick around for the full video. But first, if you're an artist, engineer, or producer and you have a mix that you need mastered, send it to us at sageaudio.com. We'll master it for you and send you a free mastered sample of it. All you have to do is set up this account, upload the song, and we can do the rest. So the first question I want to answer is, what should the loudest peak of a mix be? When preparing a mix for mastering, your loudest peak should be between -6 dB true peak and -3 dB true peak. Now let's break this down a little more and explain some of the more fundamental details of headroom in a digital system. When you're processing a signal in a DAW or a digital audio workstation, 0 dB is the loudest a signal can be before clipping distortion occurs. That said, 0 dB represents the maximum number of bits that can be used, or the highest possible positive value for the signal. Now think of this level as a ceiling, of which the signal cannot pass or become greater than. Now if you do try to push the signal past this point, the waveform will distort. This distortion will cause unpleasant sounding harmonics, which will greatly change the tone and timbre of your mix. That said, it can easily cause a lot of harm to your mix quickly, so be sure that your mix is not clipping, especially at its stereo output. By leaving about 6 dB to 3 dB of headroom, you're using a fair amount of the possible bits while leaving enough space for a mastering engineer to work. Now you may be wondering, why not just mix to -10 dB or another lower level? Well, you may have heard the phrase, using as many bits as possible, and you wondered what it meant exactly. Well, essentially it means that if your signal peaks at a higher level, then it's utilizing more of the available dynamic range. So in a 24-bit recording, you have 144 dB of available dynamic range. The closer your signal peaks to 0 dB, the more of this range it can utilize. The phrase, using as many bits as possible, comes from this idea, as the greater the amplitude is in a digital system, the more bits are being used. That said, we recommend your signal peaks around -3 dB true peak, as this utilizes the majority of the range while still leaving enough headroom for a mastering engineer. The next question that I want to answer is, how should I measure the peak of my signal? If setting the peak of your signal is important, then the metric that you use to measure your signal is just as important. Now that's why we recommend using dB true peak to measure the signal. By measuring your signal with dB true peak, you take intersample peaking into account. Intersample peaking becomes more important the closer your signal comes to clipping. However, it's still valuable to use when trying to prepare your mix for mastering. Having your signal peak at -3 dB true peak ensures that the mastering engineer will have a full 3 dB of headroom. Another common question is, should I use any plugins or processing on the master output? You can use some light compression and equalization on your master output, but only if it's used in a controlled and subtle way. Too much processing on your master output will impede a mastering engineer's ability to process your mix and make it sound as good as possible. Now, one of the biggest mistakes a mixing engineer can make is using aggressive processing on the master output. A lot of engineers stick by their decision to use mastering-based processing on their mixes, regardless of what mastering engineers request. However, the fact that your mix doesn't sound like a master is a good thing, whereas the lack of sounding finished may be cause for concern for some mixing engineers. In truth, your mix shouldn't sound like a finished master. Now, some examples of excessive processing that you shouldn't use on your mix's output are limiting, compression with attenuation greater than 3 dB, equalization with changes greater than 3 dB, harmonic distortion greater than 1%, and stereo widening plugins. If you're in doubt about whether or not you should use a form of processing on your master output, odds are it's best not to use it. Another thing you might be wondering is, can I mix with a limiter on my output to preview mastering? Now it's become popular over the recent years to use a limiter on your mix's output from the start of your mix. The idea being, you can get a better understanding of how your mix will sound once it's made louder. However, this leads to misinformed decisions more often than not. The reason being, processing your mix with any form of master processing will in turn affect all of the processing that came before it. Once the limiter, compressor, or whatever other processing being used on the master output is turned off or removed, the timbre and dynamic range of the mix can be greatly affected. With that in mind, it's best to work through a mix from start to finish without any form of processing on the master output. Instead, try to make the mix sound as good as it can without the addition of mastering-based processing. Keep in mind that by mixing this way, you're more likely to end up with a better sounding master, as the mix itself will be better. Next, let's answer the question, how loud should I make my mix? How loud your mix will be depends on the genre, as this will affect how dynamic your mix will be. Now, typically more dynamic mixes are quieter, and less dynamic mixes are louder. Considering that your mixes should peak at -3 dB true peak, the genre and the dynamics are going to affect your mix's loudness. For example, let's say you have a pop song that has a dynamic range of about 15 dB. That is, the quietest part of the song is at -18 dB true peak, and its loudest peak is at -3 dB true peak. Now, this mix is most likely going to be louder than a classical track with its lowest level at -60 dB true peak and its loudest at -3 dB true peak. The reason being, the majority of the pop song's signal will be at a louder level than the majority of the classical song's signal. With that said, it's difficult to determine an exact metric for how loud your mix should be. But if it helps to know, most masters have an integrated LUFS of -16 to -9. With that said, a mix will likely fall somewhere between -25 LUFS and -18 LUFS. But again, your mix may vary depending on how dynamic it is and the genre. Another good question is, what settings should I use when I export my mix? When exporting a mix that you intend to have mastered, you should export it at its native resolution. In other words, the file should be the same sampling rate and bit depth as the original recording. If the mix session is 48 kHz 24-bit, export it at the same settings. By exporting a mix at its original sampling rate and bit depth, you retain its fidelity. The sampling rate affects the frequency range, and the bit depth affects the dynamic range. By maintaining a higher bit depth and sampling rate, you ensure that neither the frequency range nor the dynamic range become truncated. The last question that I want to cover is, should I use dithering when exporting a mix? The answer is no. Because you're using the same bit depth as the original recording, you will not need to use dithering. If you use dithering when exporting a mix, all you're going to be doing is adding unnecessary noise to the recording, which will lessen your dynamic range. So let's listen to two mixes of the same song, one in which everything was done incorrectly, and one in which everything was prepared correctly. For the incorrectly prepared mix, we'll make it clip, export it at the wrong sampling rate and bit depth, and use too much processing on the master output. Let's take a listen to it. Now for the correctly prepared mix, we'll set its max peak to -3 dB true peak, export it using the correct sampling rate and bit depth, and avoid processing on the master output. Let's take a listen. So these are our thoughts on how to prepare your mix for mastering, but what do you think? Is there something you do when exporting your mixes that we didn't cover here? Let us know in the comment section below. Also, if you're an artist or an engineer, send us one of your mixes at sageaudio.com. We'll master it for you and send you a free mastered sample of it. All you have to do is set up this account, upload the song, and we can do the rest. But thank you so much for watching. We really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like and share this video with your friends. This way we know if you'd like to see more videos like this one. Also, you can subscribe to the channel. We release new videos every week, and subscribing is the best way to stay up to date. There's a comment section where you can leave your thoughts on this video, or you can leave a suggestion for a future video. And again, if you're an artist or an engineer and you have a mix that you need mastered, send it to us at sageaudio.com. We'll master it for you and send you a free mastered sample. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you in the next video.